Hello, my name is Frank Schroeder, and welcome to another edition of the American Family Association Presents. Our topic for tonight is the Catholic Church in a Secular Society. The Catholic Church in America has been an enormous source of good and generosity. Catholic hospitals, care for the sick and the dying, despite massive government spending to try to have a social safety net, it's the Catholic Church that still comes to the rescue of the hungry and the homeless and the poor and forgotten. The Catholic Church provides pastoral and spiritual counseling to those who no longer have hope. Nevertheless, the Catholic Church is going through somewhat of an identity crisis in today's secular society. And we're going to be exploring that over the next hour. We're very happy to have our guest with us today, Father Philip Eichner. Father Eichner is a priest in the Marianist community. He is the president of Kellenberg Memorial High School, past president of Chaminade High School, two very successful Catholic schools here on Long Island. He is also the chairman of the Catholic League for Religious Civil Rights. Welcome, Father.
Thank you very much, Frank.
How are you?
I'm okay.
Good. So, an interesting topic, the Catholic Church in a secular society. Want to explore whether Christianity and secular society are on somewhat of a crash course. I guess maybe it would be most helpful to do a little foundation, define our terms a little bit. First of all, Catholicism, Christian society, comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. What is the Judeo-Christian tradition?
Well, the Judeo-Christian tradition is that long trek of the Jewish people and now the Christian people in understanding God's designs. It is very clear. It is the Ten Commandments. It is the prophets. It is God choosing the Israelite people as his own. I will be your God, you will be my people. And they were to manifest God's power, dignity, and so forth. They weren't always faithful to it, nor is the Christian church always faithful to it. But it is a way of living. It's a philosophy of life. Every person has to have a philosophy of life, has to have an overarching philosophy on which everything hangs. And that's true of people individually, it's true of governments, it's true of companies, it's true of any human organization. It has to have a consistent philosophy. If they don't, it becomes chaotic. When that philosophy breaks down, there's nothing to it. Our philosophy from our founding fathers was the Judeo-Christian ethic. Our founding fathers were very convinced of that. In fact, in our founding document, which is really the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson is so clear on it. He says, we, not I or the people in this meeting, we hold, not have, but hold these truths, not opinions, not presuppositions, not hypotheses, to be self-evident. Means we're not even going to discuss them. These are our basic truths on which we're going to base this country. That all are created equal, that they are endowed, a beautiful word, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and governments are instituted among men to protect those rights. That is our overarching philosophy. And that was their philosophy. And what we have seen now is a renunciation of that philosophy. Remember, the church was born in Roman times. The church lived with a secular society in many different cases. What has made America unique is that it has taken that basic Christian vision, Judeo-Christian vision of mankind, of society, of destiny, and put it into a state, a government, so that our federal statutes reflected that value.
So the creation of our country and the founding documents were not, quote, value neutral, or as far as separation of church and state, it did not include not having a belief in God.
No, did not. And if you look at Jefferson's statements and Washington's statements, they all rely, even Franklin, they all rely on divine providence. And that's was woven into our core of thinking.
Well, it's funny, a lot of the secularists always like to point to Jefferson as being someone who was not religious and almost against religion. But when you go and visit the Jefferson Memorial, many of his most famous quotes are completely an opposite to that. They do show a belief in God and divine providence, etc.
Yes, Jefferson didn't like the controversies that religious sectarianism generated, especially in the English-speaking world. So he even actually put out a gospel of his own, by the way, just Jesus' teachings. And he really believed those, and they lived them. And they put them into practice, and they said, this is the foundation on which we are going to build, endowed by a creator with certain rights. It's clear.
Well, let's juxtapose that to the second part of our discussion tonight, having to do with a secular society. What is secularism?
What is secularism? In its negative form, secularism, negative form, is that you can have a world without a transcendent. Since the Enlightenment, people have tried, can we have a government without a transcendent principle, without a reference to a God, without something beyond us? Can we have that type of society? And
what was the lore for that? Why did they want to eradicate the transcendent? Was it bringing some negativism into their existence?
They thought, yes, they thought that they could be more than they could be.
Okay.
It was really a result of the Renaissance too, that the exaltation of reason, the exaltation of science, of knowledge, which, by the way, the church promoted. The church was the beginning of science. The universities were founded by the church. Astronomy was very much part of early church study, so forth. They wanted to be independent. Is man the measure of man? Or is God the measure of man? What is the measure of man? So as little Hebrews, can we have this good society? And many people thought they could, and they tried. French Revolution. We know what happened during that. Our biggest examples are more recent ones, communism and Nazism, where can you have a society, a social organization, without a reference to a transcendent? Or if you want to put it this way, their transcendent was the state. The state was all powerful, as it was in the French Revolution.
Those experiments didn't work out too well.
They did not work out too well.
Okay. You said in its negative form. If we had a secularist here, he would give a different definition. What would be?
He would say that it's the world with all the gifts that it has. And I just read an article by Father Rollheiser in which he says, we see all these difficulties in the world, but we have to have an empathy for it. Now, empathy is a very interesting word. It's more than sympathy. We have to love the world. As Jesus cried over Jerusalem, we have to cry over the mess we make of things. Because Genesis tells us that we are the master of creation. You are to dominate the world. Dominate doesn't mean use it abusively. It means love it. Take care of it. Take care of it. We are masters of this world. And the secularists would say, can't we do this without God? Well, we can try, but there is a thing that we have a certain original sin, a proclivity to selfishness, a proclivity to egocentricity, a proclivity to me first, etc. Now, if we didn't have that, we'd have no problem. So there has to be some ruler, some canon by which we define that. in which we define the other. There was an article I read recently where the thesis is put forth that everyone believes in the golden rule. Do to your neighbor what you want your neighbor do to me. And the answer to that is true. Hitler believed that and Stalin believed that. The question is, who is my neighbor? Who defines that? And even in the gospel, one man asked Jesus, what should I do in the law? And Jesus says, love your Lord your God with your whole heart, spirit, soul, body, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. The guy says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus launches into one of the most powerful teaching parables that he ever gave, of the Good Samaritan. Who was this man's neighbor? His enemy. Mm-hmm. His enemy. And at the end, the man can't even say Samaritan. He says, well, I guess the one who helped him. We even go back to the book of Jonah, the last 2 chapters, where Jonah really didn't want the Ninevites to be saved. But they're God's children too. So there's a direction. That's why we have the 10 Commandments. Would people be moral without a direction, without a restraint? We know the little child in the playpen screams and screams and wants everybody to pay attention. The world is centered on that little 1-year-old. And we hope over 18 years that it goes from a centripetal force to a centrifugal force, that it goes out. That's what we hope.
Okay. We certainly have a sense of where, you just mentioned starting with the 10 Commandments. We know where Christian teaching comes from, the Judeo-Christian ethic of the Bible. Where do the principles of secularism, from where do they derive?
They derive basically from the idea that we can be independent. Okay. We are dependent on ourselves rather than the grace of God. We are our own master, captain of our own ship. And of course the question is, well, where did you come from? Well, nobody wants to answer that.
Secularism in America, where did it really where did the greenhouse effect for that really start?
That's a good word to use, greenhouse effect. I trace it from after the Second World War, when we wanted to be independent. We took that any faith, any religious expression was partisan, was oppressive to other people. It's strange that in our society we could tolerate Muslims, we could tolerate atheists, we could tolerate all sorts of things in our society. But they started to wash it out. When I came back from the seminary in 1966, I was in Freiburg for 4 years, 62 to 66. I never came back to the United States. I came back and I was very struck by this, that the United States was like a piece of laminated plywood. And you just delaminate. You took this Christian thing off, that's Christian thing off, the other Christian thing off, to reduce it to the least common denominator. You know, when you do that to an onion, you wind up with nothing. It's all layers. I said to my classes at that time...
And on the contrary, plywood with all its layers is stronger than
Absolutely.
Than a solid piece of wood.
Absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
They all join together. Mm-hmm. You take one off, you weaken it. So they weakened American philosophy from its Judeo-Christian roots, and they were wondering, why are we having all this chaos? Mm-hmm. Well, it's very evident. Mm-hmm. And the other, I had another image with the delamination. I said to my students, you know, there's one thing in our society that is basically directly from the New Testament. And it's going to be the last thing that we're going to get rid of, but I believe we're going to get rid of it. And they all look at me and say, well, what could that be? I said, it's monogamy. Half the world is polygamous. Monogamy is a New Testament concept. And it comes from the New Testament. It's a religious thing. And we're going to have a Supreme Court case that says, why can't I have 3 spouses or 2 spouses? And we're starting to see that gradually erode. Gradually erode. Because they want to get any vestige of Christianity out of our society. With that, they got rid of the philosophy. They got rid of, and something has to replace it.
That somehow is freedom. In other words, the Judeo-Christian principle of monogamy is somehow restrictive.
That's right.
And imposing, whereas polygamy is free. Is that the thought behind it?
Yes, this whole question of freedom. You see, in the 60s,
Yes.
in the 60s, there was a very difficult. They wanted to get rid of all form. Anything that was restricting you was oppressive. Well, I say my skeleton restricts me. It's not oppressive. That form gives being. Even in language, they want to say, well, you don't have to spell it, you don't have to know it, you don't have to write it. Everything goes, it's your individual. What we've done is substituted the self. I am the measure of all things. I've become the canon of the world. And that's why when we say relativism, yes, it's relative to what? It's relative to me instead of being relative to God. All things are relative. God is the absolute. All things are relative, but they're relative to what? Relative to God, relative to what's in God's mind. See, who are you? What did God make you? Why did he make you? All right? You're in the image and likeness of God. If I didn't have that from Scripture, how would I come to know that?
The secularists would look at the 60s, the turbulence of the 60s, as a good thing. This has freed us and moved us more to a secular position, the results of which
to reason alone is going to be the ultimate criterion by which we judge everything. That's Mein Kampf and Das Kapital, by human reason. There are many things beyond human reason. I use the word, my students, mystery. They have a very poor understanding generally of mystery. They think it's Agatha Christie or it's something you can't know. But mystery is something that you can know, but you can never know it all. It's unending intelligibility. And the human person is mystery. And God reveals to us who we are. You are in my image and likeness. That changes my whole viewpoint. Christianity, Judeo-Christian ethic is a vision. It's looking out and seeing the world through different eyes. Could I give an example of that is the Christmas Carol, or in the Christmas season, the Christmas Carol with Scrooge. What changed in Scrooge was his vision, not the facts around him.
Yeah.
What he saw before was selfishness, hostility, and then he had a mystic experience.
It was a slow revelation.
A revelation to him of how wrong he was, how wrong his vision was. And he comes the next day, everything is the same, but the vision is different. That's a Christian. Christian sees things differently.
Why are secularists threatened by God?
Because he limits their autonomy. God limits my autonomy. You know, it's the difference between liberty and license. Liberty is the freedom to do what you should do, but should's a bad word. He limits my autonomy. As that little child in the playpen has to learn, his autonomy is limited by other people, by time, by space. Has to learn that. The child who doesn't learn that is a terror.
Hence the hostility, going back to our program between secularism and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is viewed as too many man-made rules.
Right, and there are man-made rules, but you know, look at the penal code for New York State. It's how thick. You're an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
We live by rules.
Mm-hmm.
We live baseball. Can't have baseball without rules, and the rules are to be a reflection of the reality. When our lawmakers sit down, they look at the reality, they say, what do you want to protect, how do we protect it, and they draw up codes that we all say we're going to live with. And those codes are to protect us, not to impose on us. Now, certainly, certain man-made laws can be impositional or burdensome. And we can all sit down and talk about some of the tax laws that we think are burdensome, unnecessarily burdensome.
When it comes to the church and its rules, or the commandments, they're really rules of self-preservation.
In many ways, exactly right. Self-preservation, preservation of society. Just take the last year we don't hear much about, but it's a big thing in the past couple of years, covetousness. A society that's covetous is at each other's throat. And our whole economic situation has been basically greed. There's a lot of greed going on. That they could do it, therefore they did it. Not whether they should have done it.
Unrestrained appetites.
Unrestrained appetites, yes. And that's why you needed something outside at times to say, my appetite here is pushing me into this, but I know I should not do it. I used the example in class the other day of a young girl who is a severe diabetic. She's 16. And I put an ice cream cone of death by chocolate in front of her. I said, your instincts, your motus, your whole feeling looks at that ice cream cone and wants it. That's very natural. So you're in a struggle now between your desire for that and your knowledge that as a severe diabetic, this could be very serious to you. Now you may be weak and give in and say, well, I'll just take a little piece. I'll just take one lick. Of course, one lick leads to 2 licks and so forth. We know all that story. And they responded to that because that's where you have to use your intelligence, your reason. And the doctor says, now, we know this is a deprivation to you. We know it's painful. But for your well-being, this is how we have to act.
Okay. Going back to the model for America coming from the Founding Fathers and Jefferson, I saw an interesting quote, again, because he is so off. There's an article, Secular Fantasies. The Golden Rule is powerless without Judeo-Christian presuppositions. It says, in his notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson rhetorically asked, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God? Our Founding Fathers realized that rights and freedoms depend on citizens whose darker angels are restrained by a received moral code. John Adams put it this way, we have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion.
That's right. There it is. You can say you rest your case. That's what they believed, and I believe that's what's true. You cannot have that unless your society accepts the call to virtue, accepts the call to virtue. You may be weak here and there, but you realize that another person's property is not necessarily yours, and that there's a respect for other people. If you don't have that, basically in your citizenry, it's going to be chaos, and chaos always invites dictatorship, force, government by fear and government by force.
When you look at some of the moral questions of the day and some of the arguably moral failings or problems in our society, be it divorce, abortion, looking at secular society and the Catholic Church, the statistics are surprisingly close. In other words, you might expect, well, divorce is prohibited by the Catholic Church, abortion is prohibited by the Catholic Church. That's not necessarily the beliefs of the Catholic flock. How's this happened?
Well, it's happening because it's the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and people want to be free. They don't want those restrictions. One of the things that has come about is the abandonment of the sexual ethic in Christianity. Even the mainline Protestant churches have sort of given up on that. And if you look at all the issues that touch today, that are really motivating the articles in the New York Times against the church, it's all sexual. it's premarital sex, it's divorce, it's homosexuality, it's abortion. It's all related to that question. So that the sexual revolution of the 60s was the major revolution, that there is no restriction on this, that this is a recreational experience. And why should there be any restrictions on it? That's the zeitgeist of our society, really.
The Catholic Church obviously teaches that this is sacramental.
That's
This is
correct.
not recreational, this is
That's correct.
divine.
And see, and even the evangelical, the Protestant churches were very strong on that up until the 60s, and they've sort of given in. So nobody, New York Times never goes after any Protestant denomination.
Because the Church enunciates those things
Very
that are
clearly.
so
That
antithetical to the Times'
Antithetical
view.
is the exact word. It's antithetical to the New York Times view of what life should be like. And they can't come and say that this is wrong, this is not according to the mind of God, and so forth. So they are open-ended,
And view the Church as just sexually repressive
repressive,
people.
archaic, a relic of the Middle Ages, and so forth. And yet, on the other hand, we see some of the excesses that occur. We see the abortions, we see AIDS, we see a lot of sexual disease that basically is promoted by promiscuity. That's what we say. I mean, AIDS is a disease that can be prevented. Can be prevented. So that's a whole different philosophy. It's picked up in our society. Fidelity, for example. Fidelity comes from the New Testament, and it also comes from our own desire, our own internal things. A boy and a girl going together, well, if he cheats on her, even in high school, that's a crime. Because we want fidelity. We basically want it. And Jesus says, well, your fidelity to your spouse is like Jesus Christ loving his church. It's a union of total intimacy and total support. I said to my students the other day, I said, you know what, when you get married, one of the things that you're saying to each other is that no matter what happens, I'll be there to affirm you, that you'll never be lost. That's why you imitate God's love. He will never abandon us. Even if your mother abandoned you, I will not abandon you, says the Lord. It's a beautiful image.
The influences of the secular society on the Catholic Church, taking a look at some of the details. Mass attendance is down. The secularists are winning.
Well, first of all, I would not use just mass attendance as the ultimate criterion,
Okay.
as the ruler for that. I believe, I'm a little bit optimistic. I believe that there is a spiritual hunger. Now, some try to say that we want to have spirituality without religion. That's nice, but it's really just a little bit of mixing up your soul. There is a desire for that, and that there are people seeking, and they might not be religiously practicing, but they are philosophically moving towards that, spiritually moving towards the Christian revelation. Just as before, we had people who were practicing but didn't understand the philosophy, didn't understand why and wherefore. So that when the shock came, they didn't know how to defend themselves. They thought that there was, it was just make-believe, and everything fell apart. You got to come to the core of it. I'd rather have someone who doesn't practice, who is searching intensely and willing to enter into the, and then the practice will come, rather than just the mindless practice. It forces the church to have a new evangelization. As they said, Pope John Paul says, the new evangelization, the new power of redemption. We have to preach that news. And I ask my students, well, what is the good news? Very few of us really can answer that in one sentence. The good news is that you have a relationship with God on his part. You are redeemed. You're valuable. You have an eternal destiny. You're a creature of great price. That's the good news. That's good news. It affirms your humanity, reaffirms your destiny, reaffirms your uniqueness.
So there is that spiritual searching and hunger out there, which is certainly a good thing. In other words, when people say, well, the church just isn't filling me up enough, apparently a lot of the principles of secularism aren't doing the job either. They're not filling
No.
people up.
No, they're not. It's not. There's emptiness, and they know that. These people feel that after a while. And you'll read a number of books come out now with people who've gone through that in their 40s, and they say, this didn't satisfy me. St. Augustine said it. God, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
One of our local priests, Monsignor Bob Batul, wrote a piece recently, very interesting, on the secular society and the church's place, and asking an interesting question. I'm paraphrasing, but what does the church do up against this secularism? Do they try to accommodate and mesh with the secular culture? Should they stay back and remain sort of as a beacon for the secular world? And there's some interesting quotes. He quotes Cardinal Avery Dulles, saying that Cardinal Dulles warns that to the degree that the church adjusts to the dominant culture, the church has less to say. By simply echoing the prevailing opinions and values, the church undermines the credibility of its claim to present a divine message and weakens people's motivation for seeking membership. A church that no longer issues a clear call for conversion is only dubiously Christian.
Exactly right. So it always comes down to the individual conversion. What does the church do? What did it do in Roman times in 300 years? It became what it preached. See how they love one another. The lived experience of Christianity converted the Roman Empire. So there is a call to interiority, to the gospel message that's clear as a bell in our society. It's clear. And what he just says there is true. If you allow it to come in, to preach, you're going to be countercurrent. When Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, that goes against common sense. That goes against reason.
So the church has to be countercultural.
Yes. Be careful of cultural Christianity. You know, many years ago when I was in the seminary, I spent a summer in Germany at a retreat house where they had a special session for seminarians. It was a wonderful program. And believe it or not, the German government paid for it for me and paid my transportation, even though I was an American citizen. And every week they had two professors come in from the universities of Germany. Every week, two different ones. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And they gave their specialty. Their specialty. And their specialty, some of it was just fascinating. And one of the professors' specialty was on developmental psychology and how people would develop and how they develop. And that he would say, we have a great problem because we are developing, maturing physically earlier, but mentally and emotionally later. So you have a huge area of the no man's land in between childhood and adulthood that really is challenging to the faith. And I've seen that, I've lived that. There's a big challenge. What are the values on which you're going to live? And when you say with the church is countercurrent, countercultural. It will help the culture, but it can't be co-opted. At that seminar, there was a German seminarian there, and he said to me, well, you know, I'm not too certain about the church in America. You know, you people Du hast keine Wurzeln. You have no roots. Being a chauvinist American, I said to him, oh yes? Well, where were your roots in 1932, 33, 34, 35, 36? That ended the discussion. Christianity isn't just roots. It's the people today have to be converted. We all have to grow into the faith. We were baptized into it, but we're not going to stay in it unless we ratify it ourselves. My point in teaching senior religion is to ratify or deny their baptism. Don't play around with it.
Speaking of you teaching, you teach over at Kellenberg,
Right.
As the president. You're a teacher in a classroom. I've been to Kellenberg, I've been to Chaminade high schools. They are distinctly Catholic. You have obviously answered the call that we must be countercultural. A lot of Catholic colleges aren't that way. There's been a lot of criticism that a lot of them have lost their identity. What's your comments?
Yes, they try to be relevant by being watered down. And I'm sure there's an honest attempt to connect with modern society on their own terms. Understandable. But you have to be careful that you are not co-opted in that process. You can be co-opted. You try to understand where they're coming from. It's like Paul going up on the Areopagus. He tried to connect with what those people understood, what they understood, and tried to work from there. We may do that, but be careful you don't co-opt and say, well, we'll be like you. We'll be like you. No, it doesn't work. You're not, and if you're not going to be fully Christian, if you don't really believe in the message, why play house with it? If the message of Jesus is not real, if it doesn't change the world, change my behavior, then it's just another little wisp in society.
If the church or the Pope, the bishops, the ministers are the main voice of the Judeo-Christian message, who are the main voices of the secular message?
The main voice of the secular message today is the media. That's their voice. And we can say, it comes from atheists and all that stuff. I don't think it's the atheists is the major problem. I think the major problem is our own hedonism.
Left to our own devices, we don't do so great.
No. Lady Gaga is the, everyone knows that. I can mention some other names. They say who, where, what, why, important people. But the media sort of takes over, and it's in the media anything goes. Sensationalism. How can I be sensational?
How about academia?
Academia has gone on the whole route of reason.
Okay.
Reason, and there's a lot of ego on it. PhD and
Does that partially confront the question of some of what's happening in Catholic colleges?
I believe it has. The person thinks that they're going to get a new theory in order to make a name for themselves. It's sad sometimes. Is there a quest for truth or a quest for being sensational? And the universities have not done us well on that issue.
I want to talk about a more troubling topic. If Catholics who have started to leave the pews, a survey of some of them, many of them would talk about within the last decade, the whole exposure of the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. There's been a lot written on it from all different sides. What do we learn from it?
Well, there are a number of things we can and should learn from it.
And I'm sorry to back up, but I guess starting more at the beginning, what caused it?
What caused it? First of all, we could go back and say human nature, all right? Sexuality is a very powerful thing. Sexual deviance, sexual sin has always been with us.
Okay.
Always been
and
with
certainly
us.
that's a big difference. You use the word sin as opposed to what you talked about before. Secularism, it's sexual license.
License, that's
This
right.
is certainly not, there obviously are some
Right.
restraints from a secular viewpoint. Uh,
but not many.
okay.
You know, the whole revolution, sexual revolution I mentioned in the 60s, gave license to a lot of things. And I was around in that era. I was teaching in that era. And I can give you chapter and verse of how this broke down and that broke down and the other thing broke down. And everybody thought this was great. It broke down also in the church. It broke down in all of society.
Okay. No institution was immune.
No institution was immune. But the church at least held its position. It didn't handle the thing well, but it held its position. This is not right. Now comes the real onslaught of the church in the 80s and 90s, past 30 years, because the church is upholding the Judeo-Christian ethic. And the people opposed to the church see the tragic flaw and go after it.
How do you mean?
They saw that there was a pattern of abuse, sexual abuse in the church. And they just drove their Mack truck right into that and said, this is what the church has been. It's been hypocritical, etc. It's a little unfair to do that because at that time, in the 70s and 80s, almost all of this is from the 70s and 80s, at that time, there was a whole sexual license going on all over the world. Plato's Retreat, swinging singles, all of that stuff, the pill, changed it all.
And certainly in no way to defend the indefensible, but there has been a large cry that what we saw in the Catholic Church is a child abuse problem. There was very little pedophilia.
Very little.
This was more teens. Absolutely wrong, but this was not children. These were usually teens and clergy.
It was basically an offshoot of homosexuality, which nobody wants to admit. It was not pedophilia. It was that the sexual expression can be meaningful with the same sex and with younger people. Younger people. It goes back to the Greeks. We even had a group, NAMBLA, I think it was, National North American Boy
Love Association,
yes.
which many secularists actually believe was to be protected or to be
That's
at
right.
least listened to.
And they had a big meeting this summer in New York, I believe. And when psychiatrists were there, that we should legitimatize the older, younger thing, that there's no trauma here and so forth. That was picked up by many people. It's prevalent in all institutions. The Boy Scouts went through it. Public schools, this woman, a professor at Hofstra, Shakeshaft, I believe she's down south now teaching. She did a study and said 10% in the public schools, but the president, the Bush administration, would not give her money to investigate
Well,
this.
let me understand that, because certainly one of the biggest problems went beyond the crisis. It was the moving of derelict clergy to a different parish. You're saying that was not novel to the church institution. There were
no.
other institutions. You're saying it happened in the public schools.
Still, that they call it passing the trash, and they have some teachers who have not taught in years but get their full salary. They come and they read newspapers all day. You see, and I'm saying that kindly because that's what we did. We believed in the 60s in psychology. So we sent all these people to psychologists.
So priests who were found to have sinned,
Right.
We'll fix them.
That's correct. And everybody
We'll
believed
send them
that.
for treatment, then we'll move them to a different parish.
That's right. And that happened all the time. That happened with other people.
That was cultural.
That was cultural. And then comes them saying that, well, it can't be cured. There's a whole other reaction to that. Isn't it schizophrenic for our country to be giving condoms to 11-year-olds, and then we get bent out of shape when that's promiscuity with 16-year-olds? Isn't that contradictory?
We're sending very, very mixed messages.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
And,
right.
and in a secular society, you're not allowed to restrain. You can't have these rules, these arbitrary rules on human behavior, especially when sex is a good thing.
That's right. You say that to the 15, 16, 17-year-old, the only sin you have is not being protected. And so they say that's okay. I think there's a lot of guilt in the United States on that, and all that guilt has been put onto younger people, onto pedophilia. All that guilt. Everything else is permitted, but not that.
Okay.
But not that. And so that's now the big whipping boy
Okay.
for this. And years ago, the public schools, the church, all people dealt with this privately, psychologically. Not that that was the best way to deal with it, but this whole society said, what's wrong with this?
Causes, you talked about the 60s. The secular society likes to say what really caused the priest sex abuse crisis: celibacy. How do you respond?
I respond in a couple ways. Number one, the vast majority of child sex abuse occurs in families by a relative, by a parent, or by a relative, by somebody they know. The vast majority.
So saying that they're not necessarily celibate. It's
No.
not celibacy that
No,
causes.
it's not celibacy that causes that.
Okay.
Not celibacy that causes that.
How about other denominations where there is no restriction on celibacy?
They have this.
immune
They
from-
have the same problem. The Boy Scouts had the same problem. They had to deal with it with a very great difficulty. Boy Scouts today have a rule that you can never be with students without somebody else there with you. You have to have two people at all times in any scout encounter because of that. It touched everybody because we thought.
But I mean, going to another topic, married clergy, and let's just start with the sex abuse crisis. The Jewish denominations or Protestant denominations where there are married clergy, have they experienced any type of sex abuse?
Oh yes, the Jewish community in Brooklyn has had a great deal of that, and they want to deal with it within their own place, so they don't want the police involved. No one ever called the police before. When I knew someone was embezzling, I didn't call the police. When I knew somebody was committing adultery, I didn't call the police. Now they want you to call the police. And it's a different optique. You can't criticize the people in the past because of the way they handled it. Probably wasn't the best, and maybe what we're doing today isn't the best. But you can't say that everybody was corrupt. I don't think we handled it as well as we could have and should have.
We're coming into our last 10 minutes speaking about the Catholic Church in a secular society. We're here with Father Philip Eichner, president of Kellenberg Memorial High School. Also, the chairman of the board for the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. What is the Catholic League?
It is an organization founded in 1948 by Father Virgil Blum from the university, Marquette University. He was a political science teacher. And it was really remember I mentioned that the anti-religion thing started after the Second World War?
Yes.
He saw these forces, originally anti-Catholic, but now really anti-religion. And he said, we need an organization to say that we're only going to have religious freedom in the United States if we fight for it. We fight for it. And we are for religious and civil rights, for our religious right to speak what we want and not to be muzzled. And we are in that process now with some of the stuff that Obamacare has put through, some of the stuff on adoption. You know, just recently, committee discussing funding for adoption agencies. The Catholic Church garnered 89% approval, competency. They refused the money. It was given to people 72 and 69. And they were asked, why? Well, we don't know. I mean, we just have the evidence before us. Will the Catholic Church have 100?
How does Obamacare conflict with the Catholic Church?
See, there's something that I would be concerned about, and it's going to sound a little harsh. The state cannot substitute for Christian charity. All of us should be concerned about the poor, the weak, the difficult, and do everything we can from our own resources. What's happening is we say, well, I pay my taxes and they're going to take care of it. It's a whole different optique. Mm-hmm. The government is not the one who should do that. We should do that. And it's a whole question of our own virtue. Mm-hmm. So we're looking for the state to do all this stuff. And of course that means more taxes, more bureaucracy. The Catholic Church is one of the most efficient charitable agencies in the world. And it's just proven, 89%. You need the Catholic relief services, most efficient worldwide distribution of goods, mm-hmm. because it comes from the heart. So to say, well, we're all going to take care of these people. Well, we should take care of them before the government forces us to do it. And that's what we have not preached. Remember you said before about preaching the gospel? Mm-hmm. How many of us preached about Wall Street? Not to use that, but the greed. The mm-hmm. greed. Mm-hmm. Remember the film, the guy, Greed is Good? In that film, Wall Street? That greed, untrammeled greed. St. Paul says, the love of money is the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. Do we preach that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're hesitant. We might lose some donations.
Well, speaking of lost donations, there is also, we talk about a priest shortage in America. What is the answer, and does it include married clergy?
That's a very good question. Will married clergy solve the recruitment problem? It probably would in the short run, although a married clergy is a very hard thing. Protestant communities will tell you that, because the clergyman is really wed to the people, but he has a family. So it's a very hard thing to do, to put together. I don't know where it's going to go, but the church has had this problem before, after the French Revolution. And wasn't it strange that in the 19th century so many religious communities rose up, so many great saints, after the aftermath of the anti-clerical experience of French Revolution? Church was in very bad shape. Okay. Very bad shape. Loss of morale. It will survive. How? I don't know, but I'm going to try very hard to make it.
Similarly, the questions raised about the married priesthood. What about a lot of women say they feel alienated? They'll go to church, but they want to know, are there going to be women priests?
I don't think so. I think part of the past 30 years is we've been given a bill of goods that there are no sexual difference between men and women. And I've always listened to what the French say, vive la différence, long live the difference, that there are different gifts, different roles. A male cannot be a mother, and a mother is one of the most fundamental experiences that a person can have. The intimacy with a child, the mother power, the power of a mother, hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. A man can't have that. And so I think the priesthood is a function of the masculine gift, just as motherhood is the function of the feminine gift.
It does not mean that women do not have a role in the Catholic Church.
Of course not. Of course not. Every priest has a mother.
As a Marianist.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, it certainly has a role in the church. And Mary as the model, the one who was involved most intimately in the redemption. See, there's two things in the church. There's grace and there's power. There's charity, there's love, there's grace, and there's order, there's power. I'm not too sure people want to be priests because they want the grace aspect or they want the power aspect. In heaven, there's only thing in heaven is going to be the order of charity, not the order of hierarchy. And you see all the people we canonize, very few of them are clerics. Most of them, bishops, I should say, most of them are just ordinary people who are obscure but who live the Christian life in a heroic way.
What is clericalism?
Clericalism, oh, that's the great evil I think that the church has experienced. It's the use of the power of the priesthood, the power that the priesthood gives in things that do not pertain to the sanctification of the people. Clerical privilege, all that type of stuff.
So,
And clericalism has really destroyed the church in Italy 100 years ago, in France 200 years ago, and in Spain 90 years ago, 80 years ago. And it may just do the same. And Ireland. Ireland was a very clerical nation, and now it's very hostile to the church. Mm-hmm. Unbelievably so, and unfortunately so. I'm half Irish.
the going back, we're coming into a last minute and a half. The sex abuse crisis has been extremely painful for the Catholic Church. What should we take from that? Is there anything that the Church can learn and have a renewal?
Yes, it can learn from it. First of all, that, as our president says, transparency is a very important thing. Honesty, dealing with problems, not trying to put them under the rug, and also being very open with it, that we all have failings, that we have sexual sins, we have greed sins, money sins. We have to be open about those and ask for forgiveness. The church did not handle it well, so I think a little more openness, a little more honesty, forthrightness, and fraternal correction.
Father Ackner, thank you very much for joining us.
My privilege.
Very enlightening discussion. We really appreciate it. We hope to have you back. I hope you've enjoyed our program. If you have, we would really appreciate your comments, and please contact the American Family Association of New York at P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York 11050. Visit our website, www.afany.org. Again, I'm Frank Schroeder with the American Family Association. We appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next week.
Okay? I think that's what you want.